the previous videos, we have discussed about the literature review is not just a summary of informations or the works that has been done by the researcher. It is not just merely compilations of informations. In fact, the authors will have to do some analysis and synthesis of the knowledge and informations acquired from the literature review. There will be critical inputs from the authors. In these videos, we're going to discuss a bit regarding analysis and the synthesis of the informations which you have acquired from your literature review. First, let us look at analyzing relevant informations. These are several ways that you can analyze the informations that you have acquired from the literature review. You can first try to understand the hypothesis of each research. What are the scientific fundamentals that the researcher based off? And how do they come about with this kind of hypothesis? Normally, during the formations of a hypothesis, there should be based on some underlying principles, which is later projected and venturing into the regions which is unknown. The purpose of setting this hypothesis is to provide a clear directions for the research work in order to test the understanding or the applications of an existing theory within the area which has yet to be proven or applied. You can also look into the details of the hypothesis to see if there is any misconceptions of certain existing theory, and you may also need to evaluate the conditions, whether it fits the applications of the hypothesis. Next, you may also try to understand the models and the experimental conditions. Normally, good publications will have those conditions clearly outlined. Some might even provide the details of the assumptions made on certain models. And on top of this, you might need to imagine the real scenario which the model or the experiments would like to simulate. You know that by fundamental, the models and experiments are meant to simulate something which is in the reality. And most of the time, when we want to conduct a research study, we cannot fully simulate a real scenario, as it is normally governed by various factors and parameters, which will make it very difficult to manage in the laboratory or in deriving the models. Therefore, normally there will be a process of simplifications of the actual scenario into the models or the experiment to a level that is manageable by the researcher, omitting some factors that could affect the results or that can give noise to your data, which at the same time keeping those significant parameters which represent the conditions in the actual situations. In a simpler word, the model and experiment, no matter how well it is being designed, normally we cannot simulate 100% of the actual scenario. However, it is still possible to have the models and the experiment to be closely resemble the actual scenario. Then from there, the research work was carried out to observe the parametric response of various parameters as an effort to explain the actual situations. With that, you need to first aware that the research works are normally trying to explain real situations, but cannot fully simulate the actual situation. Therefore, it is necessary for you to look into all the conditions for the models and experiment and have an idea how close their model and the experiment can simulate the actual situations. Is it being oversimplified, or has it effectively eliminated those factors that can affect the result? And also to which degree that the models or the experiments resemble the actual situations. You might want to look into the limitations of the models and the experiment as well, as you're going to expect the discussions and findings given by the relevant researchers are normally on basis of the results of the models and experiment. Let's say now the models and the experiments have some limitations. Are these limitations critical enough to affect the findings in terms of the actual situations? These are also something that you might want to look into. The idea here is not to critique their works, but you need to be critical in evaluating the research study. Next, you can also make connections between the principles or the findings by different researchers. Some of the researchers in their discussions, they do make the connections as a means to support their findings. You will have to evaluate whether those are valid, whether it is adequately proven, or the connection itself is another form of hypothesis given by the relevant researchers. You may also encounter some authors do not clearly state the connections of their findings with the other researchers. As during the literature review, you have gone through various theories and principles. This is where you can synthesize the connections between the theories and principles given by different researchers and see the linkage and also the relationship among themselves. You may also compare and contrast various informations. It is not just about the theories, principles and concepts. Sometimes the tested conditions as well as the properties of material being used, or even the tested result may vary slightly. Therefore, you can make some comparison and contrast, as some changes in terms of the properties or the characteristics of one of the parameters may influence the others. You may also compare in terms of the general principles, whether a majority of the researchers in the same field are agree with a certain principles, or are there any contradictions between the findings of different groups of researchers. Comparing and contrasting different informations can be interesting. If you really look into details of the findings given by different researchers, sometimes you do find some contradictions. At least this was my personal experience. And then you will have to seek for the possible reasons for such contradictions. Sometimes you may have the answer for those contradictions, and sometimes you do not have it. It doesn't matter that you do not have the answers for those, but at least you know that there are some inconsistencies in terms of the findings by different researchers, and there must be a reason within it. This could be something that you might want to look into, or something that you have to be careful of while doing your own research later. I'm not suggesting that you have to choose a side, whether pro to one side and against another side. What I do recommend is attention could be given on that particular issue. If your research also have a similar parts, that might eventually lead to you to one of the sides later. And you need to always remind yourself not to be biased or make hasty conclusions before you have completed the research. Also, you can also find for the strong points and the loopholes within their research study. And what you can see for the components of analysis of the informations that you have acquired from literature review, it constitutes a lot of critical thinkings, questionings, and also seeking for answers. This will help you to dig deeper into the existing knowledge that you have acquired, so that you gain better understanding and have a clearer image of the subjects that you are studying. You are to be reminded with the good practice, where you need to be critical in evaluating the course, and also always be suspicious of the claim made by the source. You know that the nature of the research is actually exploring into the regions of unknowns, because we do not have prior understanding of certain thing, or we do not completely understand a certain thing. The research is being triggered, and normally the findings are acquired on basis of the result and data that we have acquired from our experimental program or some model simulations, and then come back to these models and the experiment. You know that no matter how good is the design, your models or the experiment cannot fully simulate the actual situations. Therefore, by fundamental, you are actually trying to use the model to represent the actual situations, and you are actually studying the models and the experiment performance. Based on the response of the models or the experiment, you are trying to explain an actual situations. With that, whichever the findings claimed by the source may not always be true. Some may be arguable, some may seem logical, or some even may seem valid under certain ideal conditions. We are not to penalize their works, as we don't want to encourage a culture of penalizing each other within the research community. But whenever you use their findings, it has to go through a critical evaluations, which at least those findings and principles must first be able to persuade you. With that said, you can consider reading the research papers written by the other researcher. It's a dialogue sections with them. Although they may not be there, but in your mind, you can still dialogue with whichever claim that be made by the researcher. Then you inquire and then find answers for your inquiries. These are the purposes of analyzing or synthesizing the knowledge that you acquire from the literature review. It helps you to identify the unsolved issues. It also helps you to bring out something new to work on, and it determines the problems or limitations of the existing models or experimental design, and it presents a novel idea and recommendations. In other words, when you analyze and synthesize the informations, you will go one step further into what has already been known and been published. There will be new things there, and also new insight from what they have documented. These are a few example criteria that you can do to evaluate the informations. These include the authority, who are the authors, and his affiliations, whether the authors is reputable or his affiliations is one of the top institutions in the world. The authority can give some insights or indications in terms of the credibility of the words and findings given in the source of publications. Second is the accuracy. Does the information seem credible? Any source cited to support the informations? and it is always a good practice for you to cross-check the cited source. You know that it is a habit of academicians to cite as many references as possible so that their publications looks good, as if it is rigorously done. Sometimes these citations can reach to another extreme. Even small things which is commonly known by the community is also being cited. Some even citing for the sake of citing. Whenever encountering something which is in line to your research study, citations was done without actually looking into their works. We have to be careful on this also, as the motive of citing is not really meant for the benefits of the reader, and some citations can be quite misleading. Personally, I feel that when we need to cite some research work, we should cite the findings of the researcher which he actually studied in rigorous, rather than his personal opinions which he also quoted from somebody else. For an example, a researcher is conducting an experimental study to investigate the response of something, and he has done rigorous investigations which leading him to some findings, and in the conclusion there he highlighted again his finding, and these are normally the things that we can cite from that particular researcher. However, we do often encounter students citing a papers without actually reading through the contents of the paper. Instead, the students cite the statement made by the relevant researcher in the introductions, which is actually his personal opinion on a state of situations. Some may write this kind of citations in the more professional manner. They cite those with some facts and figures, but when you cross-check the cited source, it was also borrowed from somebody else who actually did not perform that kind of research. And if you trace along the sources to sources, at the end of the day you reach to the origin of the source. It is mere opinions by somebody else, and that figures are actually just an estimations of certain things which is in his perceptions. Therefore, whenever we want to cite some facts and figures, we will need to first determine the credibility of those informations. This is what it is meant by the accuracy. You may also evaluate in terms of the scopes, whether it is relevant or whether it is appropriate. Also, you might want to look into the currency, whether it is latest development or whether those things has already been superseded. This sometimes can be quite common in the community of the researcher, especially when the researchers are referring to certain standards of code of practice. Some code of practice has already been superseded by another due to the latest development or better understanding on certain fields, and yet those superseded standards are still being referred extensively. That means the researcher cannot keep himself up to the latest development. Then you have to be careful with their finding as well. This is just an example of the currency, but if you sometimes found yourself citing the superseded standards, it depends on the information that you are giving. It is always a good practice for you to cross-check with the latest development. Probably the parts that you are citing still remain the same in the latest issue of the standards. Therefore, its concept can still be applicable. That will be on case-to-case basis. The best way for you is you always get hold for the latest issue of the relevant informations within your capacity, so that you can deliver something which is the latest and you can confidently present to the readers or the examiners. Next, you might want to look into the objectivity, whether the source of publications is biased, systematic methodology, or justified findings. You would like the relevant research is done in an objective manner, systematic and rigorous. This normally can be reflected from their writings. Do they provide you sufficient details? And you may observe from their discussions whether they cross-check their findings with the other relevant existing theories, or you can look into their research methodology, whether they are properly done. And lastly, you're talking about the purpose of that particular study, whether the purpose and the problems that they intend to resolve is in line, or whether the purpose of the respective papers is in line with your study. These are all the aspects that you could look into when you do the analysis of existing theories that you have acquired from the literature review. What is being proposed here is not a must to you. I will consider this as a guideline to you how you can do analysis on the informations. And when you do the technical reading, you need to position yourself to be non-biased, be critical when evaluating all the informations, and always be suspicious of the claims made by the source of publications. You should not accept everything being claimed by the authors, as same like you, they are also exploring into the regions of unknowns. Just that they are slightly ahead of you. They have done their study, and based on the result, they give you some findings of their works.